Iranian and Russian news cancelled, first by the television cartels, the telecoms people, then by Ofcom too. And this show cancelled off Bristol Community FM by the Bristol Mafia. But not cancelled here. So, Martin, the death of Bruce Kent this week, on Wednesday, I was pretty shocked to see no mention of this. I mean, we get the death of some obscure American musician no one's ever heard of on the BBC News, but nothing to do with Bruce Kent.
I think it was a bit older than 82.
Sorry, 92, yeah.
Yes, that's what I thought. News management goes on all the time. And the BBC at the moment is under the cosh of Nadine Dorries, and they are basically towing the line. There was an obituary in The Guardian by Peter Stanford, who used to be the editor of the Tablet. But, of course, he's of no interest to the general public as far as the BBC are concerned.
Well, he's of interest to the general public.
Well, he is.
Following his work.
I think in the previous era they would definitely have covered it.
Well, I think they should now. I really think it's a terrible omission for them to just sort of pretend that he doesn't exist. This, in a way, I think is a deep insight into the editors of the BBC these days, who this is something that we don't want to have to think about, therefore it doesn't exist.
Yes, I mean, I think what's the interesting thing here is to compare the BBC now, ignoring this particular story, and in the past where they would have felt obliged to cover it as part of their remit. And that says a lot, doesn't it?
It does. I think it says a tremendous amount about the sort of not see attitude. Well, it's not as if, that it hasn't been discussed. It's just that there are people there thinking, well, or maybe it could be simply they're scrabbling around for days and days on end trying to find someone politically correct enough to do a piece about it or an obituary or something.
Well, I think it's more sinister that not mentioned at all. Mm. Yeah, I mean, they don't have to cover it in great detail. It's not that, it's of interest, but it's not of that much interest. I mean, people die all the time. But in a previous era, I think they would definitely have had it as an item on the mainstream
news. Well, they should now.
But they don't do it now because the Tory government. That's because.
It's because the BBC has become an arm of the Tory government. And I mean, that process started back because I can remember growing up the BBC being something that you actually wanted to listen to because you knew you were going to get both sides of an argument. You may not be, perfect in terms of balance, but for example, also the dramas had a political edge, didn't they? You remember Edge of Darkness in the 1980s? Yeah. A very sharp political edge. The BBC were prepared to face that and do it. Now it seems nothing.
Well, that's because of the success of these things, like, Ken Loach's drama documentaries like Cathy Come Home and so on.
They repeated that recently, didn't they?
They did, yeah, they repeated on BBC 4, that's right.
Very, very powerful. And of course they're now talking about abolishing BBC 4.
Well, of course, we don't need intellectually challenging TV. What are you on about?
Is it because the BBC is a competition to people like Murdoch and Sky?
Well, it's two things. They obviously, the Murdochs and the Berlusconis and what have you, they don't like the BBC because it gives a quite well resourced alternative to the stuff they pump out in their tabloids, and they find that very annoying because it is quite authoritative, and also the other thing, of course, from a commercial point of view, they take up a huge chunk of stuff they'd like to make money out of. They want to run Strictly Come Dancing. If the BBC runs Strictly Come Dancing, that's money that they not going to make.
I'm not so sure the BBC are wise to be competing, say, for example, for football rights when there's lots of money involved, or something like Strictly when there's lots of money involved in franchising these things. This real strength surely has got to be balanced, fearless, investigative journalism.
Yeah, but you've got to understand that the conception of the BBC is originally put together by Wraith, is it's not just going to be a news channel. The news is authoritative.
Inform and entertain, yes.
Yes,
sure.
Inform and entertain. And, of course, by having Strictly Come Dancing on, followed by Cathy Come Home, followed by News at 10, you actually get an audience actually looking at stuff that they wouldn't otherwise look at. It gets much bigger audiences for the news programmes. Yeah?
To misinform, to miseducate, and to make it cringeworthy with their dire state of comedy. I mean, that's where they are, it seems, these days. It's such a pity to see. I mean, they're still doing some good stuff, like their brilliant 2-part documentary, last year on eugenics, the BBC, but it's, the idea that you can have somebody as important as Bruce. I mean, we're going to hear from Bruce Kent in a minute, and this is an interview done by him about 6 or 8 months ago, where he talked about how he came from being quite sort of gung-ho and pro-war into the Catholic Church and then into the peace movement, into CND, which had an absolutely enormous boost in the early 1980s. When the Americans decided they wanted to bring cruise missiles into the country, CND really took off. So what do you make of him as a figure historically?
Well, I would say in terms of the anti-nuclear movement, he's got a similar influence and stature to E.P. Thompson, the historian. And they obviously, E.P. Thompson set up the European nuclear disarmament, which had a slightly different focus. It wasn't just focused on Britain. But he was, obviously, in terms of winning over what you might call radical Christian opinion, he was very powerful. And, of course, that included Quakers, not just Catholics.
Well, all sorts, I think. And it wasn't just... I mean, I can remember going on a CND march in the early 1980s in London, which was absolutely heaving. And I think this is one of the things where... that Bruce Kent managed to achieve with all of this was that there was a tremendous amount of... What was it about crews that gave... Because there was the Aldermaster marches, obviously, which Bruce Kent wasn't really involved in back in the 1950s. Very powerful, where people went to the nuclear weapons establishment at Aldermaster. I think they marched from London, I think.
That's right.
And with thousands of people just to say, look, these nuclear weapons are a really bad idea. We should just disarm because they would kill innocent civilians. They are an absolutely horrendous terror weapon. And at the very least, making the point to the military that they've got to think very, very carefully, and to the government about how much public resource to devote to this. But then it was a bit of a sort of lull after the Aldermaster period. What was it about crews that really, really piqued the interest of the public and got them joining CND in their droves? Well,
I mean, the Aldermaston marches were actually about British nuclear disarmament. That's another, people didn't get this. They weren't calling for everybody to nuclear disarm. The call was for Britain to nuclear disarm, because we're only a small country, and what's the point of us having them? We could start a war, but we certainly couldn't finish it, so what's the point? The Americans have got them, the Russians have got them, let them sort it out. So it wasn't, in fact, as harebrained a policy as you might suggest, and there were ex-admirals and so on saying, well, yes, what's the point of wasting the money on it? If we've got money to spend on defence, let's not spend it on this, because we're never going to use them.
Well, actually, the whole policy of nuclear weapons for the Brits was very much Winston Churchill's idea, wasn't it? He was the one that was pushing it after the war.
Yeah, but also it was Clement Attlee and the Labour government who also said, Ernie Bevan said, we're going to get one of these and stick a Union Jack on it. So that was another aspect. That was the mentality of the era.
Okay, because the development of nuclear weapons, I find quite interesting. 1940, it was this Frisch-Piles memo over in Birmingham at Nuffield University, where they first came up with this idea, apparently, when no one had done it before, of making uranium go bang and turning it into a bomb. And there was then something called the Quebec Agreement was signed in World War II, where Winston Churchill and Roosevelt got together and decided, well, we're going to have the Americans actually develop and build this bomb, because Britain doesn't have the resources to do so. Then by the time of the end of the war had come, Martin, this is quite key really in all of this, was Winston Churchill was told, well, sorry, up yours, mate, by the Americans. We're having this, and if you want it, we're not going to share all this knowledge that we've got with you. That's what we said we would do in the Quebec Agreement. You're going to have to build it yourself, and that's when the British development of the bomb started.
Yes, and in actual fact, it might have been better if the British had just said we don't need them. We didn't. We decided to waste money on them. Don't forget that Churchill was also in favour of nuking Russia. We now have the documents under freedom of information, and the Americans as well. And he was very much in favour of let's nuke them now before they get any. And actually, that was the plan.
They were already developing them.
Well, so they were, because of course people like Klaus Fuchs and others who helped
Victor Rothschild. Let's not forget Victor Rothschild's role.
Well, the point is that Fuchs was not somebody like Rothschild who's an oligarch. He was an anti-Nazi activist from Germany who got involved in producing it, and he was key in passing all the information to the Soviets. They didn't catch him for ages.
I don't know if you ever read Roland Perry's book, The Fifth Man, about Victor Rothschild, but right the way through World War II and the Cold War, top secret stuff was being passed to Stalin. In fact, Roland brags in a way in the book when he talks about the idea that Stalin was getting information about British technological developments before Winston Churchill was. It was all being copied over to Russia, and this was a major part of when Victor Rothschild, after the war, went to Stalin and said, right, we want you to vote for the creation of the State of Israel. The fact that he'd been doing all this work during the war for them was a major part of them saying yes to all that.
Yes. Okay. Now, I mean, this is all a bit of ancient history because this is all before Bruce Kent came on the scene.
That's right. I know.
So I think we need to skip over to the question you asked initially, which is about cruise. This is because cruise missiles are short-range missiles. So they've got, and they're much, they were a new technology at the time because they flew close to the ground.
They're medium range, aren't they?
Well, they're medium range, that's right. But I mean, they're not an intercontinental ballistic missile.
Yeah. So, but the point being is that they didn't have any sort of fixed silo sites that could be nuked by the other side.
Yeah. So in other words,
so
they definitely increased the possibility of a sneak attack on the Soviet Union. And of course, the Soviet Union had similar missiles. They weren't the SS-20 was a similar range missile, but it didn't have IT technology in it at that stage. That's one of the...
It didn't have what?
Proper Western IT technology, yeah? Cruise missiles are run by computers, yeah? SS-20s are just a good old-fashioned rocket thing.
But they are similar to the cruise, aren't they?
They've got the same kind of range.
Around. They can rumble. It's like a truck, basically, a bit like a mobile launcher. The whole point of this is that you can hide one of these in, say, for example, an industrial shed somewhere. Yeah. And if you decide you want to have a nuclear war, you rumble it out, and hopefully that shed isn't on the enemy's target list.
That's right. Now, the point is that both sides have developed these short-range weapons. But, of course, from the US point of view, these short-range weapons are no threat at all because they're thousands of miles around the other side of the Atlantic. So there's a basic geographical imbalance, asymmetry.
Yeah, I think they're actually classed as intermediate range, aren't they?
Because short range is even shorter than that. Yeah. That's right. But the point is that the possibility of a nuclear war fought only in Europe, which the Americans would be able to sit out, was being put in place here.
It was.
This is why there was such a huge movement against these missiles across Europe. And ultimately, of course, Gorbachev came to power and agreed to get rid of short-range missiles. And they were all got rid of until very, very recently when Donald Trump said, no, we want short-range missiles. And this is one of the major causes of the war in the Ukraine, because the Russians are saying, you are going to have to take all those short-range missiles out of Europe. And if you don't, we're going to attack the sites where those missiles are with our conventional explosives, and then you'll have to decide whether you're going to use nuclear weapons. This is how close we are. We're as close to nuclear war as we were in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it's not happening in the Caribbean, it's happening in Ukraine. And this is what people don't realise about underlying all of this.
Well, it's interesting. I think I find it fascinating, Victor Rothschild's role in the spreading of all the nuclear secrets that Britain was privy to anyway over to Stalin during the Second World War. The book, by the way, is The Fifth Man, Roland Perry, who's been interviewed on this programme probably about 2 years ago. Bless him, he's teaching at a university, he's an Australian journalist, teaching at a university in Sydney still, I believe. And but also, what about his role, Victor Rothschild again? I hate to keep using this Rothschild word, that apparently is some sort of conspiracy theory to even mention it. But he was the key person involved in destroying the BBC back in 1987. Margaret Thatcher obviously didn't like the BBC. What was happening is they were doing a balanced job in interrogating some of the naughty things that the Thatcher government had been up to. One of which was most powerful, probably, was a panorama programme called Maggie's Militant Tendency, which looked at the far right Martin within the Tory party.
Yeah, and of course that was a red rag to a Tory bull. As far as they're concerned, the BBC isn't there to investigate their right wing for being too right wing. And of course, on the other hand, you can say, well, the Daily Mail isn't there to give Jeremy Corbyn a fair hearing, is it? And that's just, it used to be, people just regarded that as rough and tumble. But of course, increasingly, they want to control narrative.
Yeah, well,
More.
I felt really cheated having joined the BBC in 1989 to then see the whole thing being taken apart from within, and that was due to Victor Rothschild. It was him, as Marmaduke Hussey says in his biography, Chance Governs All, his autobiography, Chance Governs All. He devotes a section of that, a couple of paragraphs, to the call to get rid of the Director General, Alistair Milne, whose son, Seamus Milne, was Jeremy Corbyn's Director of Communications. He was also an excellent columnist at The Guardian, now booted out by Kath Viner, the new editor. But that role was quite insidious, because Marmaduke Hussey was the chairman of the Board of Governors. He, in his biography, explains that Victor Rothschild approached him saying, "Can you sack the Director General of the BBC?" And that was the first inkling that there was that the BBC Director General was going to be booted out. He was replaced by Michael Checkland after a few weeks or months. Michael Checkland, by the way, wasn't an editor. He wasn't a journalist, and the Director General is supposed to be the chief editorial person at the BBC to make the editorial decisions about its direction. He was replaced, Alistair Milne was replaced by an accountant, Michael Checkland, then after a few months by John Birt. Now, John Birt was just slowly but surely was bringing in the kind of commercialisation, what he called producer choice, into the BBC, and that was what was killing it off when I was there. I mean, I was watching as nepotism was filling posts, people who'd been there for years, and brilliant journalists excuses were being found to put them into boring jobs and, very dull stuff that they were getting to do, and some of them just being simply contracts ended, never to be seen again, and that was what they called producer choice. So Victor Rothschild played an important role both in this nuclear story and in the destruction of the BBC, who still, I don't know actually, they may have in the last few minutes said something about the death of Bruce Kent, who's the chairman of CND for many years, and probably Britain's number one peace campaigners. I thought, though, we'd start with a look at Bruce, and going back to this period of CND's big successes in the 1980s, where they had big marches in London and that sort of thing. And one of the other things that happened to the campaign for nuclear disarmament is that Michael Eavis and the Glastonbury Festival decided to embrace CND and give the profits from the festival as a donation to the campaign for nuclear disarmament, much to people like Bruce Kent's delight.
It's 10 years since the first modern Glastonbury Fair, perhaps thousands since the summer solstice was first celebrated here. But this is the first year the festival has officially had a political motive, and that motive is disarmament. This year, the profits go to the CND. Supporters of the CND may be a minority of the 40,000 rock fans here, but they're a growing active minority, for whom the American cruise missile is as much an object of contempt as the American presence in Vietnam a decade ago. Catholic priest Bruce Kent, attending his first rock festival, seemed almost bemused by the evident sympathy for the movement he leads.
Well, it's just grown enormously, beyond anybody's imagination. We had about 3,000 or so members at the beginning of 1980. We now have about 21,000 national members. We had about 150 groups. We must have now 900 groups. And new members are coming in at the rate of 300 a week. It's just, it's been out of control administratively. So many people have got involved.
Most of the slogans and stickers here today have been against the cruise missile. How important has that been in the revival of CND?
Well, it's been very significant. The cruise is seen as something very sinister. It's got to be dispersed all around southern England on these great lorries, so there's a kind of eerie thing about it. Will you have a cruise at the back of your garden? It's an American instrument. We have no control over the cruise, and I think that is a particular source of resentment as well. And I think people just feel that there are more than enough nuclear weapons in the world. The arsenals are so enormous that we certainly don't need any more of either of our own or Americans in this island.
Well, that's true, but of course, underlying all of this was the fact that these short-range missiles actually destabilised the existing balance of power. And of course, you can't. That was clear not just in this country, but across Europe. So there was a very strong anti-nuclear movement in Germany and in Italy, for example, where the rest of the missiles were going to be placed. And the Pershing missiles in Germany created the possibility of a 2 or 3 minute attack on Moscow, which of course the Russians are really fed up with this. And we nearly had, in 1983, a nuclear war, because the Soviets took all this rhetoric by Thatcher and Reagan very seriously, especially the deployment of these short-range missiles, and they thought that the West was planning a first strike. We know that now because we've seen all the documents. So they were absolutely on edge. And what happened in 1983 is they thought they were under attack, and we came within minutes of annihilation. So when we marched, and I marched as you did in that era, we were absolutely right, because the history now shows that we nearly did get blown up by the stupid people who deployed those missiles.
Yeah, and that's a fascinating point. And I think this is what we still resent today with what's going on in Ukraine, is that much of what seems to be going on in Europe in terms of tensions between East and Western Europe is for the benefit of the Americans.
Well, that's right. It's pretty clear what's going on now, isn't it? I mean, what's it to... One of the founders of NATO said the purpose of NATO is to keep the Germans, the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. And that's exactly what it is still doing. Still doing,
isn't it? Anyway, you were talking about 83 there. That clip from Glastonbury was 1981. We move on now to race ahead to 1985. Where because of the success of the campaign for nuclear disarmament in the early 1980s, it was quite clear that the secret services decided they were going to investigate, infiltrate, attempt to take over the campaign for nuclear disarmament and influence them. In fact, they got some guy, one of their MI5 people, doing the accounts of CND, which is obviously quite a powerful position to be in. But who blew the whistle on that? Well, a lady called Cathy Massiter, and here she is talking to Channel 4 and Hugo Young, who went on to work at The Guardian. I know Hugo Young. But here he is talking to her, Cathy Massiter, about Bruce Kent, and actually a bit of a clip with Bruce Kent himself being shown the picture of one of the agents that MI5 had infiltrated into CND by 1985.
By 1981, the peace movement had become a mass movement, mounting the biggest demonstration ever seen in Britain.
We will translate these measures of nuclear disarmament into practical action, because it is only...
A year later, MI5's need for more inside information on CND became urgent.
I think it was perceived as more than ever necessary that we had to be able to answer very precisely whatever questions we were asked about CND and its subversive penetration, which meant that our study had to be perhaps rather closer than it certainly would have been otherwise.
How did you achieve that?
One of the means that was used was the introduction of an agent, a chap who had in fact worked for MI5 for many years, 20 or 30 years altogether, into CND headquarters.
The agent was this man, Harry Newton, a 60-year-old lecturer in trade union studies and a lifelong activist in left-wing political groups. He'd been recruited by MI5 in the 1950s, when he was a member of the Communist Party. He became treasurer of the Institute for Workers' Control, a left-wing think tank supported by prominent trade union officials like Jack Jones and Alex Kitson, and MPs such as Tony Benn. Harry Newton joined CND in 1982, and his first job for MI5 was to attend CND's annual conference.
We regarded it as very important to know as soon as possible after the conference who the new people on the National Council were, so that we could sort of make our usual breakdown of how many subversives were on it and could pass the information along to interested parties in Whitehall. After that, he became involved in CND headquarters. They have a lot of volunteers work at CND headquarters, sort of mailing things and doing odd jobs, and he simply went along and volunteered his service.
So what, he was your eyes and ears?
Yes, I mean that was the basic intention, yes.
So what level of information would he report to you?
What tended to come across was very general information about what was going on in CND headquarters. It was fairly low-level stuff. I mean, he was able to sort of chat to people like Bruce Kent, this sort of thing. Harry was still very caught up in the idea of the international communist conspiracy, and therefore had a bit of a tendency to see the hand of the communists everywhere. I mean, he had quite a strong opinion that Kent might be a crypto-communist. I personally saw no other justification for this whatsoever, but that was certainly a view that he expressed.
That's something which might find its way onto Bruce Kent's MI5 file.
Yes, indeed.
We showed Bruce Kent a photograph of Harry Newton and told him that he'd been a long-standing MI5 agent who'd infiltrated CND's headquarters.
Isn't it awful? I think taxpayers ought to have a right to know what is being done with their money. Who's getting salaries for all this sort of nonsense? They come in, we can show them anything they want to see. There's no secret.
Harry Newton told MI5 that he thought you were a crypto-communist.
Really? Well, they've overpaid him in that case. I'm not a crypto-communist. I know what crypto means. I'm not a communist.
Harry Newton provided MI5 with internal CND documents and papers.
He did, on one occasion, provide a diagram of the layout of the offices. He, in fact, provided that quite off his own bat, so we hadn't asked for it.
Presumably that would make it easier if you wanted to burgle the place.
Very much so, yes. Yes.
I mean, could that be what he was thinking?
I think this is what he had in mind, yes, that one day we might want to have access to it, and therefore we would need this sort of information.
Well, I mean, I knew all about that before we heard it, and of course, Bruce's death, untimely death, as it were, allows us to look at it again.
That's the point, is revisiting it. That was a programme called 2020 Vision with Kathy Massiter from Channel 4 from 1985. Things have moved on since then, though, haven't they, with the infiltration by security services, by the police, of basically pressure groups now. If you have a pressure group, it's likely, I mean, for example, with these climate groups, all sorts, of course. There's Palestine groups, there are kill the bill group, these sort of things are all likely to be infiltrated. And the thing is, where is it that the infiltration starts to turn into control?
Well, I think that's a very good question. Back in it's a rather innocent days. I mean, as Bruce Kent is saying there, anybody can come and look at our accounts. This is pretty crazy, you know. We're not a secret organisation. But of course, it's not just about looking, you know, they used to be justified that we're looking for subversives. You know, everybody's allowed to have their opinions, but of course there are foreign agents, the communist conspiracy and all of that. And that was given as the excuse. But of course, what we now know is that for many, many years, and it's not just the official intelligence services, it's unofficial groups connected with them who are not, in fact, under any kind of scrutiny, are steering Western politics. And this is what's been going on for a very long time. And we think of Russia as a kind of controlled society.
Well, we've got your kind of Cambridge Analyticas and people like this.
Yeah, well, all of these people are linked. And in actual fact, because the whole idea of psychological warfare, information warfare, countering disinfo, this whole area of observing and controlling and directing society has blown out of all proportion since 9/11, which was, of course, an action of the deep state, the Western deep state, in order to create the conditions to, you know, radicalise this cancer even further. So we are living in, surveillance capitalism with an authoritarian streak. And we were then, but we were less aware of it. We are now, and it's very, very, I mean, think of the resources that are committed to this. We claim that we can't afford public toilets in Bristol, but there's no doubt millions being spent on this sort of thing in our name.
It's actually, there doesn't seem to be any limit on the amount of money to be spent on this, or weapons for Ukraine and that sort of thing. Anyway.
And the other thing, of course, is the integration between the intelligence services and the drugs industry, which creates a whole other source of funds for these kind of activities.
Black operations. So let's have a listen to Bruce Kent himself now, taking us through, I suppose, in a way, his career, because he started off with, as he explains here, surrounded by guns and bombs and weapons and the idea of fighting in the cadets. But then he slowly but surely worked his way through to chairing this Nuclear Disarmament charity.
I started off in a very warlike life. Cadet corps in school. I was an excellent bugler once when I was 14 years old, and then went on to be a proper cadet in a boarding school. And every meal I had in the big dining room, we had 8 holders of the Victoria Cross on a portrait. So we were not a peaceful lot, really. We were quite warlike, and everybody went into conscription, and as I did, and it was a normal thing to do. So how on earth did I get involved in CND, which I did? How did I get involved? When I was ordained as a Roman Catholic priest and went to a parish and became the director of a youth club. I saw some nice outings that somebody called Pax Christi, I never heard of, Pax Christi had organised. And so I got some of my youth to go on these outings, pilgrimages in the summer, and it went down very well. And about a week later, a man came and said, would I mind being the chaplain to Pax Christi? Well, I thought that's pretty rapid promotion. But anyway, that's where I ended up with Pax Christi. And it wasn't until much later when I bumped into CND. And I bumped into CND in a very aggressive way because I was busy marrying people on the Monday morning of August the 29th, and Easter Monday, and I had about 6 or 7 brides to deal with, and they were all late. Everybody was late, and I was furious. I expected people to be on time, and I asked why were they all late, and they said because some lot called C&D are walking down Kensington High Street and blocking up the traffic. And I thought, who the hell does C&D think they are if they can interrupt with my weddings? So that's how my introduction to C&D. But I wore off my hostility later on when I met an absolutely marvellous Jesuit called Thomas Roberts, who wasn't very popular with the other bishops. But he said to me about nuclear weapons, he said, look here, Bruce, are you willing at some stage to press a button to kill hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians? And I said, well, no, but no one's ever put that to me. He said, well, that's what nuclear weapons are, mass killing of innocent people. Do you agree with that? I said, no. And that began my downhill slope into C&D. And I became then a chaplain or something, I've forgotten what, in C&D. But C&D in the 60s was going downhill, in the 50s was going downhill quite rapidly. It wasn't a big organization anymore. The Vietnam War came along and took a lot of interest and so on. So we had committee meetings of about 7 people in a convent in Euston, and that was C&D's national figure. So the Polaris submarine was the thing that drew our focus, and I did go up to Faslane, to Polaris, and operated strongly up there with taking holy water and blessing the base and exorcism, what I call the devil out of the base. Well, that didn't go down very well, I can tell you, with Catholic right-wingers. Who's he talking about a devil? So that was the early stage. And C&D took off radically in the beginning of the 80s with the cruise missile crisis and everything. And suddenly we were landed in Hyde Park facing 100,000 or at least many thousand people in Hyde Park packed out. And so that's when the C&D that I joined really flourished in a big way and spread all around the country, Wales, Scotland, all over the place. People taking direct action, people going to prison, all very heroic stuff. A lot of people involved.
Yeah, so much less so now, Martin, probably, isn't it, to say that CND is from the 1980s, when it hit a high point with 100,000 people or so in Hyde Park.
Yeah, but also CND was part of the Stop the War coalition. There was Stop the War, CND and the Muslim Council of Great Britain. And I think the 3 organisations cooperated very closely during probably the biggest demonstration ever in British history, against the war in Iraq. And I think and one of the things he mentioned there is that the Vietnam War came along in the late 60s, and those of a radical disposition thought, well, never mind stopping nuclear war, what about war? You know, because that's what leads to nuclear war. And I think the other thing, of course, was the agreement between Reagan and Gorbachev to get rid of short-range missiles and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Suddenly, was nothing to fire anymore. We're friends with the Russians, so what's the problem? But of course there is a problem, because nuclear weapons can't be disinvented, and the kind of imperialist, rapacious nature of the Western ruling class means that we're still facing nuclear annihilation.
Well, I was very privileged back in 2015 to interview Bruce live on our FM show on Bristol Community FM, and I spoke to him about these sorts of issues, including that specific thing, Martin, about whatever happened to the peace dividend after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
The whole business of renewing Trident is absolutely, we're back to Rudyard Kipling, that we've got to be bigger and stronger than anybody else in the world. It's absolute nonsense, but that's what we're pretending to do. And, of course, nuclear weapons have no value against the people who actually do threaten us now. I mean, ISIS, who are clearly a clever and manipulating and dangerous lot, they're not worried about dying. They're going to paradise. So you can't threaten them with nuclear weapons.
What would you say to people like Rory Stewart MP and others who are saying, well, actually, the Russia now is becoming more of a threat, and actually that the nuclear weapons have kept the peace for decades because it's although you've never used it, it's a threat that you may use it that actually keeps the peace. This whole idea of mutually assured destruction.
That's what they always say. But we've had I don't know how many wars between states, probably 35 or 40 since the atom bombs were dropped, and lots of other civil wars as well. And both the major powers, America, United States, was totally humiliated in Vietnam, fleeing from the top of an embassy building by helicopter, and their nuclear weapons were of no significance whatever. And the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and were kicked out 2 years later. Nuclear weapons are completely irrelevant. I mean, the Argentinians had the cheek, to take the Falkland Islands, and there are we bristling with nuclear weapons. It's an illusion of security, and that's what people have to know, have to realise.
You've lived through the end of the Soviet Union, Bruce, and we were supposed to have, in the early 1990s, something called the peace dividend. Oh. But it seems like now that's slipping out of our grasp.
It's gone. The world is now spending, believe it or not, nearly, $1.75 trillion US a year on war and weapons. It's an enormous sum of money. It's more than anything else we spend on. And yet we don't talk about it. And that's one of the problems of many of our big charitable organizations, raising money for good causes abroad, but they very rarely make the link with military expenditure that is really draining countries. That's not true of War on Want. War on Want are head and shoulders above the others on that issue.
So that's Bruce Kent, who died this week, aged 92, speaking to me back in 2015 on this show when we were on FM, before we got booted off by the Bristol Mafia. Final clip from Bruce Kent, though, Martin, is what he actually was contacting us to talk about on that occasion back in 2015, which is secret terror courts. So he was very much aware that the whole sort of terrorist threat was also being used to shut down justice here in Britain.
The court system at the moment, with regard to people who are under suspicion of terrorism, is really that you could be kept in prison or under house arrest indefinitely. You can't get out of the secret court, the SIAC, Special Immigration Appeals Commission. You can't get out of that, and you don't know what you've been accused of. All that the High Court can talk about the procedure wasn't proper or something, so it goes backwards and forward between them. You can't get to the Supreme Court, and until the Supreme Court has turned you down, you can't get to the European Court of Human Rights. And so I'm dealing with a chap who's been effectively in and out of prison since 2003, and without any hope of really ending the procedure and getting back home to Algeria.
So what's he been accused of?
How do I know? That's the whole point. The accusation and all the evidence with it is secret. You wouldn't believe it. I mean, I went to a public meeting and I said this the other day, and the chap at the back said, "Don't be ridiculous. This is England. It couldn't possibly happen." Well, it does happen. These people, the Special Immigration Advisory Commission, hears secret evidence and secret witnesses, and nobody knows what they said or who put them up to it. And it may well be, in this particular case, that it's actually the Algerian government who's done it. That's what happened in the Libyan case. Once that came out, the British government had to pay a great deal of money in compensation. But nobody knows who's producing the evidence, and so you can't rebut it.
So you're saying that evidence is being produced by foreign governments, which is convicting and imprisoning people here, and nobody knows if that evidence is in any way true?
No, it's not put to anybody, and I don't know it's foreign governments. I don't know anything about it. All I know is that the tribunal is secret. Everybody in the tribunal, all the witnesses and ordinary people are asked to leave the court, and then something happens, and then you get a ruling.
So that's Bruce Kent there. Final clip with him talking about these SIAC courts, Martin. I suppose he's concerned that because of the so-called threat of terror, which largely seems to be a threat which is dished out by the NATO intelligence services, in fact, that the threat of terror, it means that we can't have justice anymore with no jury trials, no open courts and this sort of thing.
Well, that's the whole point of it, isn't it? You create a terrorist infrastructure like Al-Qaeda was created by the Western intelligence services to fight in Afghanistan, took lots of people from Libya over there, trained by our own security services and security forces, and then supposedly went rogue in 9/11, but that's another canard, really. And of course you then say, because of this threat, we can't stick with the tried and trusted principles of open justice. And you know how we can't do that because it's very dangerous. You saw what happened on 9/11. All those people were killed, so we can't have normal justice here. But of course, what in actual fact that does, it allows the deep state to corrupt everything, to create more terrorist attacks. What we need is independent police investigation of the intelligence services without fear or favour, and those who are guilty to be sent to prison for life, and life to mean life. Unlike in Donetsk, where you can be sentenced to death. But of course, maybe there is a case for the death penalty for terrorists inside the security forces. An example has to be set, I would say.
Do you think the Russians are actually going to execute these people, or is this just a sort of shot across the bows saying, well, actually, we've got these guys, and you better prove that they weren't just mercenaries working for someone else, and that they were officially working for the Ukrainian government. They have to prove that.
Well, also, I believe, I haven't looked into it because I haven't had time, they have admitted that they were involved in the abuse of civilians in Mariupol. And of course, the Azov battalion have had their boot on the face of the people of Mariupol since 2014. And these guys are part of that. They're not just British that are going to be put on trial. A lot of these Azov battalion people are going to be put on trial in unrecognised courts, as I said on the BBC earlier. But the Ukrainians are trying Russian POWs for war crimes. So I think both sides are going to put loads of people on trial. Let's have a look at the evidence. And let's everybody go back and find out where the real truth lies, like what happened in Maidan Square in 2014, when all those demonstrators were assassinated, shot through the head by NATO snipers. And there must be people in the British military who know all about that. I want those people arrested, put on trial, and if necessary, shot.
Okay, we'll be hearing a bit more later about Ukraine, no doubt. But, Martin, this week we've had some, I suppose two main bits of news I'd pick out are, one is the attempted, the confidential